All right, so this next topic is going to be about creating height and depth in your mixdowns. A lot of people that I know who are getting into production, especially people who have taken the time to really work out how they want to approach their songs, how they want their songs to feel. One of the most common struggle points that I have found is dealing with your stereo image, trying to create this illusion of depth in your mix. It's a very, very tough topic. It's very, very difficult to kind of break into. But once you have it on a conceptual level, I think it suddenly becomes very easy. Part of the struggle point is that we're dealing with something fake. There is no such thing as depth in a mixdown. We can create this illusion, but it's just that, an illusion. If we look at the layout of any given sound system, right? The most common scenario is that you have two speakers, and those speakers are angled in such a way that the sound waves are coming in towards a person. This is the person. The information that's being transmitted is only the left channel and the right channel. There's nothing here. There really is nothing here. But we can hear kind of like this box that exists kind of from about here to about here. This box is how we perceive the space of the elements in our mix. If something is shared evenly between both channels, we perceive it as existing in this range right here. We're going to call this the phantom center. It's going to be perceived differently whether you're listening to it on a speaker setup or whether you're listening to it on headphones. I'm going to be basing this on speakers, but if you're wearing headphones like I am right now, sounds that are all the way over here on this border, they're going to be felt as if they're right up here against your ear. Same for the other side. And then things that exist in the phantom center, it'll feel kind of like between your head, and everything will kind of exist in that space. This is due to the way that the human ear locates sound. If we're in nature, right? If we're in nature and we are just some person who is like, let's say we're just walking through the woods, right? And let's say there is a bird, right? This is our bird. This is our bird, right? Now, this caw is going to scatter in a bunch of different directions. It's going to go this direction, it's going to go this direction, it's going to go that direction, it's going to go that direction, it's going to go this direction towards us, this direction kind of towards us. It's going to go everywhere because it's a wave. It emanates out like a wave in a pool of water when you drop a stone in. It kind of circles out from there. This one right here will reach our left ear, and then this one here will reach our right ear at a different time. And those timing differences are what tells us, oh, there's something in this direction. Because it hit my left ear 20 milliseconds before it hit my right ear. If you're in some sort of enclosed space, like a room, you will be given extra information. Like if instead of the forest, let's say this is a bird cage. Our poor little friend is locked up inside a bird cage. We have like the room around us like this, right? The sound waves will bounce off this wall, they'll bounce off this wall, they'll bounce off this wall, they'll bounce off that wall, and they'll go directly towards us. It'll all explain where the sound is, but also the dimension of the space that we're in, because this reflection will bounce off this wall and then shoot back towards us. This reflection will bounce off this wall, shoot towards us. This one, bounce off towards us. This off, bounce towards us. All of these different waves will reflect or reverberate off of the surface, and based on how many of those there are, based on how the frequencies are dampened, and based on how long it takes for those sounds to die away, we can understand sort of the dimensionality of the space we're in. This is what reverbs are trying to emulate. If we go back to our original drawing, which I'm going to just redraw because I just erased everything, we still are being given all of that information with these two speakers. This is mimicking all of that stuff to us right here, the person who is listening to the sound. Now, if the sound is being panned to the left, it's going to be louder in that channel. This is where panning comes in. If I jump over here and I look at these pan pots right here, as I turn this to the left, what I'm doing is turning up the left channel in volume and turning down the right channel in volume. That creates some sort of bias that our ears are hearing as, oh, over there. There can also be timing differences. If you have something that hits the left ear a little bit sooner than it hits the right ear, we'll create that separation. And depending upon the timing, provided the two signals are different, it will create this wide feeling, because it's not just that one side's louder, it's that it's earlier. If you have the same exact signal, but one is delayed, it will sound wider, but it'll sound somewhat unnatural. This is something known as the Haas effect, H-A-A-S. If I wanted to show this off, let's grab just a saw wave. I'm going to use Serum for this. I'm going to take a saw wave right here. I'm going to turn this down. I'm going to put on a delay, and I'm going to set this one to 1 millisecond, this one to about, let's say, 10 or 15 or so, and without, with, all of a sudden, it feels like it's on both sides of our head. It's very wide. If you're listening on speakers, it's going to feel like the sound is kind of existing on the extremities. It'll be almost as if you have the sound split into two. Like this doesn't happen, and you instead are getting this information right here. That could be cool. That creates stereo information, but it is not the same thing as having a difference between the two channels. In addition to that, we also have to consider how close or how far away the signal is. When a sound is close to you, there's a couple things that happen. One, you hear less of the reverb. You hear more of the sound's frequency range because the overall amplitude is much higher. 3, there is less directionality. If something is really close to you right here, then there's going to be a much, much, much shorter distance between the sound hitting your left ear and the sound hitting your right ear than if something is on the other side of the hallway, where it might hit your left ear anywhere from, 10 to 30 milliseconds later. Lastly, the closer something is, the further away something is, I guess, the less direct sound we hear compared with the reverberation of the sound. Going back to our example with the bird, if, say, the bird is right here, it's just going to be right in front of us. It's going to hit our ears. We're not really going to hear all this extra stuff. But if that bird is all the way over here, then we might not even hear the bird itself. You might just hear the sound of the bird hitting the wall and then bouncing back towards us. So, equipped with all of this information, we can now start to approach this kind of weird topic of creating height and depth. So far, we've mostly talked about depth, but to talk about height a little bit, that's generally an issue of the frequency domain. My original drawing of the space that you're going to hear sounds in was a little bit off. I'm going to redraw it here. Generally, it stops right about at the tweeter, the smaller speaker in a speaker setup. So it's like right about here. It stops at the border of both of them and extends a little bit down below. Now, tweeters are speakers that are focused on the high end of a signal. Below them, you usually have what are called woofers, which are generally focused more towards the lower frequency sounds. High frequency sounds are very directional, and we generally perceive them as higher in the actual space, like physically higher, than a low frequency sound. This is because when we think about low frequency sounds in the real world, you're talking about like cars driving by, earthquakes, elephants, stampedes, big, heavy things that move the earth, move the ground. There isn't as much directionality to them. There isn't as much placement of a space for those sounds. As a result, bass and sub-bass, it kind of feels like the ground beneath our feet. So when considering height in your mix, the only real consideration, for me at least, is how much of a given frequency is in the sound. If there are more low frequency sounds, it's going to be down here. If there are more higher frequency sounds, it's going to move up towards here. This is usually why, if you're listening to a song and they have a live drum set, it physically sounds as though the cymbals and the hi-hats are above the snare drum and the toms. That's because of the way we perceive it. That's because of the way we perceive these sounds in reality. We're creating this illusion of it. And frequency applies to depth as well. As I mentioned, if something's closer to you, there's more frequencies that you can hear. But generally, height is going to be directly connected with how much high end versus how much low end a sound has. Now that we have an understanding of kind of how we can approach the height in our mix, we can now start looking at depth, because that's really where a lot of the work comes in. So I have a basic loop here. It's not mixed. Nothing is put together in a way that is going to be EQ'd. I'm just doing a kind of very basic volume mix right now based on just the waveforms that I see in order to get this to not clip. This is sort of our starting idea. I'm going to start to create depth in our mix. So already, I've done a little bit of mixing just from the samples, like this top loop. Has a bit of space, and the vocal sample that I picked has a lot of processing already on it. But let's recontextualize everything. Let's try and find space for all of these elements. So to start, I want to take these vocals and I want them to sound further away from us. There's already some stereo in it, and I don't necessarily want the sound to feel like it's to our left or to our right. So I'm going to create depth without touching the pan pots. So what we're going to do is use 3 specific tools to create the illusion that this sound is much farther away from us than it is. I'm going to use an EQ, I'm going to use a reverb, and I'm going to use a compressor. Potentially going to use a utility plugin, but we'll see how much I need it at the end. If something is further away from us, we actually hear less of the high frequencies earlier than we hear less of the low frequencies. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just turn down the high end of these vocals. I'm not getting rid of them. I'm not completely cutting them out. But already, it's starting to get further away from us. The reverb is going to do a lot for this. Notice, as I increase the dry-wet, have more of the reverb over the dry signal, it sounds even further away. For now, I'm gonna keep this a bit high. I'm gonna put this at like 60 to 70%. So already, it's sounding much further away. But there's one more thing that I feel like we should be doing, and this has to do with the physics of sound traveling through air. Now, if you have never thought about sound in this way, this might be a little bit weird to conceptualize, but let's say we have some sound signal. Like, going back to our original example, we have our little bird friend. When the bird makes its noise, caws or chirps or whatever, there's like a circle that comes out. I'm going to do it as a semicircle, but there's a circle. In here, what's happening is you have all these little air molecules. I'm going to draw them like this. Just imagine all these little circles as air molecules, kind of just doing their thing, being air, being oxygen, a little bit of hydrogen, a little bit of nitrogen, all that fun stuff. Now, this sound wave is going to bump into these molecules and move them out of the way. And then they're going to bump into these molecules, and they're going to bump into these molecules, and they're going to keep bumping through these molecules as the sound wave reaches towards its destination. That's why we can hear things. However, there's still a physical connection happening. The sound wave has to actually move through those air molecules. And as it does, as you can see, like if I were to draw a path, you know, maybe here we would have all of this space, here we have all of this space, and then here we have an even smaller amount of space. It will compress. And because of that, because they're acting almost like a buoy or like a sieve, right, or a funnel, where the sound waves being funneled through all of these air molecules, it compresses the wave, and it gets not removed, but similar to how a compressor works, it removes the dynamic range, the distance between the largest part of the sound and the smallest part of the sound get closer and closer together. So we're going to use a compressor to emulate that effect. If something is really close to us, we'll have more dynamics because we'll get to have a greater distance between the loudest point of a sound and the quietest point. But farther away, you get something that sounds a bit closer to this. So turning this off. So now the sound is much further away from us than it did before. It feels like the distance changes. Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these chords right here, and we're gonna bring these chords closer to us. Now, I'm also gonna use a EQ here. I am gonna use reverb, but I'm not going to use compression because I want to increase the dynamic range. So, first thing we're gonna do is I'm actually going to increase a little bit of the high frequencies and a little bit of the low frequencies. Notice how it feels like it's getting a little bit closer to us? And this is what M was talking about with the proximity effect. In microphones, this is a consequence of the way the diaphragm picks up sound waves. When I'm standing at this distance away from my microphone, the lowest frequencies of my voice have a fair bit of time to reach the microphone and terminate. If I get much closer to the microphone, then those low frequencies are going to get enhanced. They're going to become exaggerated. That's where you get that famous radio announcer voice, that "Welcome to WQRX, the wave." And exactly, if you pan the microphone around, it will start to sound like it starts here and moves over towards your left ear or towards your right ear. It creates a lot of directionality in the sound. You can mimic this effect just by boosting the low end. And similarly, we don't want to have a huge dry wet. Notice how it all of a sudden sounds much further away. We still want a little bit of that reverb, because otherwise it won't feel very natural. Without, it sounds much further away. So now, let's take this and let's start creating a bit more distance in the mix. I want this to sound a little bit wider. I want it to sound something a little bit bigger. I'm gonna split this into two halves. I'm gonna have the first half and the second half. In the first half, the sound is going to be further to our left. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna use a utility for this, and I'm going to pan it slightly to the left, and I'm actually going to increase the volume of the side signal by using this width control. Now I'm going to automate this, go the other direction. And in terms of where I want this to be, I want it to be behind these chords, but I also want this to be in front of the vocals. I'm going to pan this to the left. I'll just do it that way. Now let's push this back a little bit. I'm going to do this a little bit differently than I did before. I'm going to turn down the high end. Instead of using compression for this, I'm actually going to use distortion, because I want this to add a bit of color to the sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this up until it starts to clip, and then I'm going to turn down the output. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this in every situation, but it is a more interesting way of reducing dynamic range. And if a sound does not feel super engaging, you could use this and then sculpt it like we're doing here. I'm actually going to turn down a little bit of the low end too. Now, instead of sending it to a reverb on the channel, because listen to what happens when I put this on here. The reverb, let me exaggerate it. The reverb is also slightly panned to the left. That's not what happens in reality, typically. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna send this to a reverb. If you hear, even though the sound's on our left, we hear reflections of the sound on the right. That's much more natural. That gives us much more of an understanding of the space of the signal. I'm gonna turn this down to a more reasonable level. And I'm actually going to accentuate it a little bit with what Widler said by panning it a little bit more to the right, using, or on the reverb, which again, will make it feel a bit more like a physical space. Just turning it up so you can hear it a bit more. It's exaggerated, but now you kind of feel like, you know, there's a bit of a room around you and that's existing in that space, right? So I'll pull this all back to a more reasonable level. Now we've taken all of these elements and we've put them in a space. So the chords are kind of right in front of us. We have this ARP over in our left ear. I'm actually going to automate this over to the right and move this closer to the center, just so that it can be on both sides. Now, let's create a little bit of height in our mixdown. So this bass is the floor, it's the ground. What I'm gonna do, just to be safe, I'm gonna make it mono. Now I know the signal is already mono, but I recommend for low frequency sounds, because we feel them down below us, we really don't want to have any directionality there. You can if you don't care about it being any sort of realistic space, but for this example, we're trying to craft a more realistic area for all the sounds to exist in. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to compress the signal. That's all I'm gonna do. I'm not gonna EQ it. I'm not going to add any reverb. I'm just going to compress it and turn it up so that it has a more consistent presence. And it'll feel kind of like right in front of us, almost at our feet. Now it feels a little bit too high in the mix. So what I'm actually gonna do now is I am gonna do a little bit of EQ. I'm gonna push it down by low passing it. Notice how as I pull down that EQ, it starts to get lower and lower. And conversely, if I switch to a high pass, first boosted the highs, it all of a sudden feels like it's higher up in our space. But let's reverse this and keep this just low down to the ground. I'm going to actually just limit the kick here to do a similar effect, because I want the kick to be kind of the main element. And then I'm going to move this drums loop, this top loop, higher up. We can do that by removing more low end, adding a little bit of highs. That's probably the most drastic effect. Notice how without this, versus with it, it feels much higher in the mix. It feels kind of like it's floating above things. I'm going to give it a little bit of reverb as well. But since I don't want this to be super far away, I'm going to keep the dry wet fairly low. And this is a little thing that can sometimes work. I wouldn't say it's an always thing, but it can sometimes work. If you have a smaller size space, if the size of the room is smaller, the reflections bounce off the walls more frequently, and it sounds brighter. It sounds like there's more high frequencies. So I'm going to take the size, I'm going to pull it almost all the way down. And the decay down. So now we have something that feels much higher up in the mix. I would even potentially add in another reverb to give it that darker tone. Nothing saying you can't do this, right? And now let's hear everything in context. This is with everything turned off. Right in the center, arp, over on the sides, chords, much closer, vocals, much further back. Big difference. Now we have height, we have depth. We could go a bit more, we could start adding more effects to create the illusion of space. Things such as chorus can do this. More panning on elements, more elements that are specifically one direction or another, and more elements that are different between the left and right ears. These will all add up to a much bigger space. Now, last thing I want to notice that I did not hard pan. I'm not hard panning here on this sound, because when something is hard panned, it feels kind of like it's right up against us. It feels almost unnaturally placed. Whereas, if you have something that is much closer to the center, there's still information in the right ear for us to counteract that. And I find that in general, I'm only doing hard panning if I'm doing multi-tracked recordings of a sound. If I'm doing like multiple takes of a vocal, I might have one that's mixed center in the mix, one that's panned hard left, one that's panned hard right, and those two hard left and right will kind of add together to create this illusion of big, wide kind of chorus effects. That is probably the limit of what I think I can talk about today. Hopefully that's enough for most people. I feel like it should be. That's really all you need in most of the cases. Now, M has a question about making something feel in front of us or behind us, and that's kind of a weird thing. It is a bit of a complicated subject. I can start to approach the concept, but it is going to be kind of weird. So let's take this, and let's ask ourselves, how could we make this thing sound like it's behind us? Well, one thing I could do is split this into 2 processing chains, and on one of them, I'm going to have the signal phase inverted against itself. So when I play this, we get silence. Solo anyone, we hear it fine. But together, they've completely phase canceled against each other. Now, I'm going to take a comb filter and put it on one of those channels. That's going to start creating a difference between the left and right channel. Now it's creating a difference between the left and right channel on that phase inverted signal. Notice how it's kind of starting to push from in front of us to behind us. This is a very kind of janky, ultra simplified version of how binaural audio works. You take a signal and you essentially have 4 or multiple copies of it, and you're using very specific forms of comb filtering to create these phase differences that to our ears sounds like it's coming from behind us or to our side. Whereas without it, it generally feels like it's in this space in front of us. So there's definitely more to it. It's definitely more complicated than I'm making it. But I do think that it is a useful thing to think about and play around with. Otherwise, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, do all the friggin' YouTube stuff. Check out my Twitch stream. That's where we do this stream every Thursday. Check out my Discord. Check me out on Patreon. Follow me on Twitter. Do all that social media bullshit. And thank you for watching. This will be where we cut the video.